We live in a social order which I believe is profoundly undemocratic in a whole variety of ways, and because of a very skewed distribution of power. See, one doesn't want to go to the point of saying, no, there is no democracy at all, to the point of saying, yes, it is a democracy. I think there is a whole range of in-between where, in effect, one can speak. I mean, I'm very impressed with the degree to which people who run the economic system, banking, finance, manufacture, not small firms, not a scatter of small firms. When people speak of free enterprise, they speak of small firms. No, multinationals, vast conglomerates whose decisions affect workers, consumers, the city, the region, the country, and the whole world. People sitting in Detroit or in Frankfurt or in London whose economic decisions affect everybody in this country and affect people in Nigeria or Bangladesh or wherever.
I first met him as a student at the London School of Economics. Oh, you must come up and hear these lectures. They're by this guy called Miliband, and they were the lectures on which the State and Capitalist Society was based. And I sat there through some of those lectures and said, yes, this is it.
One of his favorite expressions was actually borrowed from Marx, doubt everything. And I think he was very much a doubter of everything. He never took anything for granted.
A Marxist who came to Britain to flee the Nazis, Ed Miliband's dad. According to the Daily Mail, Ralph Miliband was a man who hated Britain.
He was I want to call him a socialist professor here at the London School of Economics, and he had some quite strong opinions about how society should be run. And I know the Daily Mail also tried to smear Ed Miliband with his father's history, which I thought was quite crude and unfair.
In a statement, the paper said Ralph Miliband hated such British institutions as the Queen, the Church and the Army and wanted a workers' revolution. Our readers have a right to know that.
His perspective politically was very much that of a Marxist. He was a supporter of Marxist ideology.
I was aware of an article, having thought about it now, during the campaign of Ed Miliband that the Daily Mail put up about Ralph Miliband. Whether or not I agree with it, I don't know. Yeah, I do think that the monarchy has an important place to play in this country, and definitely the army as well.
He wasn't a jingoistic person, but he certainly loved his country and wanted his country to be improved. And I think that's the greatest tribute I could pay to him. To say he hated Britain was an absolute lie and an insult.
He loved Britain in all kinds of ways for the home it had given him and the space in which he and others were able to work and to think. And I think he was always grateful for that.
He never wanted to live anywhere else but Britain. It's complete rubbish, the man who hated Britain.
When they say that he hated Britain, I was not willing to put up with that, because my father loved Britain. My father served in the Royal Navy. He was a refugee who came here. He found security in this country. He took great comfort from what this country offered him. And I'm speaking out as a son.
I know he was Jewish, and I'm also Jewish, so I doubt he did, because he must have been an immigrant. Yeah, so from Poland. So I doubt that he hated a country which was willing to take him in.
He loved London, for example. So I just thought it was sort of red baiting, really disgusting Cold War stuff coming from a paper that supported fascism in the build-up of the Nazi party in Germany, and in a way that made it even more kind of revolting, and there was a slightly anti-Semitic sort of feel to it.
The Daily Mail attack was clearly full of anti-Semitic tropes and undertones. The Jewish alien who's full of subversive ideas, who has no real loyalty to any country.
Of course he didn't hate the UK. He hated the class system in the UK. And he hated rags like the Daily Mail, who were dedicated to reproducing that class system at all costs. And I think that's the way to respond to this appalling attack, which I think has blown up in their faces, actually, I'm very happy to say.
And if the result is that people are encouraged to go back and read his books, then I think that is absolutely tremendous.
On the day after the Daily Mail published their attack on Ralph Miliband, we immediately put out all our Ralph Miliband books in the window and also dug out all our Hated by the Daily Mail badges, which have been a perennial bestseller. Immediately sales of Ralph Miliband books went up. We also made a jokey poster that we put up online, and that ended up going viral, supporting Ralph Miliband.
Ralph's books have sold very well, and I think that was a response to people's sense that, hey, this guy may have had some good ideas, rather than he was someone who was to be defiled and despised for being a Marxist.
And what made him a Marxist is because he was very conscious of, you know, what happens to people who don't have any advantages in life, who don't go to university. Because he was very aware of poverty, you see. His parents were very poor.
Marxism did provide tools for understanding, in a way, understanding not only capitalism's the injustice and exploitative relationships at the core of capitalist growth and capitalist development, but also capitalism's sort of intelligence, but capacity to further its own interests. You know, so capitalism is a very agile, kind of restless system, and I don't think it can be easily tamed. And I think Marxism helps you understand why. You know, that it has to grow all the time. So it has a sort of ceaseless energy, you could say, and so it can only be transformed. It can only be, in a way, dismantled, and that requires dismantling it at its core, which is at the point where, you know, capital grows through the exploitation of labour, and so it requires that organisation of labour to sort of refuse that exploitation, that oppression, and so I think Marxism, you know, it will become more popular not as a dogma or a kind of abstract theory, but as a set of tools, really, to understand what's happening and understand the strategies that are necessary.
There is a permanent struggle throughout the historical process up to today between the people who own and control and the people who don't. That's one thing. And secondly, he says that this struggle can be resolved positively by establishing a cooperative, harmonious, socialized society. And class struggle now, today, has got to be widened out to cover a whole range of movements and demands, the women's movement, black movements, ecology movements, and the rest.
He called himself a Marxist, but he was always critical of some aspects of Marxism.
A clearly outstandingly intelligent boy. He had a friend, and through his friendship, he joined actually a left-wing Zionist group. That was his first real political initiation, and apparently at the time it was really divided between Trotskyists and communists. And then very soon he and his father came to Britain, came to London.
He and his father decided it was time to get out of Belgium, and they walked from Brussels to Ostend, and I think it's 100 kilometres, got on the boat, and then left behind my grandmother, so my dad's mum, and his sister.
In many ways, what he had thought when he was 16 and what he thought then, which was when he was nearly 60, hadn't changed fundamentally. He said he thought he'd always been an independent Marxist, and of course he'd learnt a lot more, and of course his analysis was more sophisticated than it had been when he was 16, but he didn't really think he'd changed fundamentally.
When he fled the horror of Nazi barbarism, he of course famously went to Karl Marx's grave in Highgate Cemetery and clenched his fist and pledged to dedicate his life to the working class and to the struggle of the labour movement.
He had no political organisation to belong to, so he was really learning English, wandering around London, trying to sort out a confusing world in which he'd been forced out of Belgium, and he was really trying to understand. And I think, in terms of his later political development, the fact that he was trying to make sense of things by himself created a lifelong habit. What he found was, on the one hand, something which he quite strongly admired, which he was surprised about aspects of British life, and he was astonished that the British in general seemed to be quite sure that Britain would ultimately win the war. He was amazed by that. But at the same time, I think he was finding a kind of superiority towards foreigners, towards other European countries, towards France, which he loved actually, and sometimes it came out. He felt that he was made to feel very foreign. A bit later, he was going to Acton Technical College to improve his English, and found the teacher, sort of not sympathetic to him as a young 16-year-old in very difficult circumstances. I think it was all those kinds of things which made him make that sort of explosive reaction. However, even then, it was quite clear he didn't really believe that the British, he didn't really hope the British would lose. He said, "I almost do." It was kind of emotional reaction for a moment.
And this is a photograph of Ralph in the Navy. That's him, the second from the right. He was what was known as a headache in the Navy. Headache was a person who listened into foreign radio stations, and his job was to sit at the top of the boat and listen into the German radio, because he had learned German. He was not a pacifist during the war.
The enemy being Nazi Germany was never for a moment, he had no doubt about that at all. He wanted to be able to fight as soon as he could, and he needn't have, he wasn't conscripted, he needn't have done that. He abandoned his education to go and do it. Had to finish his degree after the war. So yeah, he was absolutely committed to doing what he could in that fight. He blamed the British upper classes in particular, in fact people like the Daily Mail, for appeasement, for being pro-Nazi. He had a personal aspect. He was deeply worried about what was happening to his mother and sister, who were hidden in Belgium, and he didn't know what was going to happen to them as Jews in Belgium, stateless Jews in Belgium. As a young Marxist during the war, he was relatively pro-Soviet. I wouldn't want to say that there was no aspect of pro-Soviet feeling in him. There was. Harold Lasky was really Miliband's mentor, and both of them were interested in both Marxism and democracy.
He was one of the founding figures of the New Left in 1956 and 57. One of the cardinal principles of the New Left was to oppose the Soviet repression in Hungary, and the pages of the Socialist Register, which Ralph edited, were always open to dissidents and oppositionists in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union.
For a long time, in the 1950s, while being critical and independent, he had some hopes. I think he had some hopes of the Soviet Union. Maybe the Soviet Union had done something, though he wasn't uncritical of this either, but had done something important in terms of economic and social policy, but that what was wrong was the politics and the lack of democracy at a political level. And maybe it would evolve in a more democratic direction. And I think he thought that most during the Khrushchev era. So I don't want to say that his criticism meant that he was totally anti everything that was happening in the Soviet Union. He thought there were some really important developments which were provided a basis for hope for socialism.
Marx did believe in a, I won't say universal truth, but did believe that in what Karl Popper called large-scale social engineering. And the Bolsheviks, after 1917, indeed before, also believed in large-scale social engineering. That is, radical renewal, radical transformation. And there are two ways of looking at this, is to say, anyone who believes in radical change and radical renewal of that kind is bound to be moving towards the Gulag archipelago or towards dictatorship or repression. Another way of looking at it is to say, no, there is no inevitability about this. Our societies need radical renewal. Either you believe that humanity is condemned to live as it is, or you believe it is capable of a much better, much more glittering future.
Because he was so independent, he was always critical. He never had any models, really. So that even, you know, if people saw China or Cuba or Vietnam or whatever it was as a model for how things should be, he was too independent to ever accept that any of them were the way forward. And similarly, he was critical of all parties.
He was always just almost shocked and amused too by the extent to which British socialists, you know, including trade unionists, you know, in the end, you know, deferred to Parliament, to the Crown, to the whole sort of establishment. You know, they wanted to be sort of loved by them and embraced by them.
Several general elections, popular cry was that Labour in office would be so irresponsible that the disintegration of the empire must inevitably follow. Indeed, to read or listen to the utterances of the Tory party leaders, one received the impression that they really believed the Union Jack was their sole property. How convenient on their part to forget that throughout its long history, no one class or section of our people held a prior claim to the credit of the development and progress of the British Empire.
This is, I think, one reason why he was so impressed by Tony Benn, you know, who turned his back on the peerage, who in a way had the confidence, having sort of been in the establishment, had then the confidence to say, no, none of this isn't the way to achieve radical change. So he was, that I think was a crucial influence on him, you know, and he could see there was something in the Labour Party that that went beyond parliamentarism, but wasn't strong enough to overthrow this deeply entrenched set of institutions, which is what parliamentary socialism studied and showed to be so deep.
The essential argument of parliamentary socialism is that the Labour Party has always put constitutionalism above socialism. When it came to the crunch, the parliamentary aspect and the constitutional aspect always predominated. When he first wrote it when it came out in 1961, he wasn't actually going so far as to say that the Labour Party was definitely unreformable, or that it was definitely a barrier to socialism. He was saying that that's what it had been.
Well, I thought it would be valuable and helpful if we held a meeting in the House of Commons to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Socialist Register, but also to maybe have a discussion around the ongoing relevance of Ralph Miliband's ideas and works.
So what then was the kind of political work that Miliband saw the Socialist Register as doing? And Miliband in particular had seen this early New Left movement as a preparatory initiative for something a good deal more oriented politically, as he put it.
Socialist Register that he created with John Saville was an incredibly important forum for him. And once again, he hoped through something like that, a bigger movement could develop.
Parliamentary Socialism, which he published in 1961, is a study of the ways in which the Labour Party's deeply rooted attachment to the parliamentary system inhibits, obstructs and neuters any socialist impulses within it.
Throughout Parliamentary Socialism, which he finished in 1960, he was really describing a situation where the divisions between the Labour left and the Labour leadership seemed to be about how quickly to move towards socialism, how far to move towards socialism. I mean, he summed this up by saying the belief in the effective transformation of the Labour Party into an instrument of socialist policies is the most crippling of all illusions to which socialists in Britain have been prone. Then, in a way, one's got to look at his collaboration with Tony Benn, who clearly did believe that the Labour Party could be transformed.
It didn't fit into any of the other categories. It wasn't in any way pro-CP. It was completely dismissive of the CP. The interesting thing about that book, I think, is that although he himself wasn't taking it as the Labour Party's had it, there's no prospect at all, many people who read the book interpreted him as saying like that. There's a famous quotation by Paul Foote, for example, who said that it was reading Parliamentary Socialism that led him to abandon the Labour Party.
The Labour Party was founded back in 1900. It had a very parliamentary orientation. It was very resistant to what it seemed as non-legitimate forms of struggle and protest. It didn't have a commitment to the class struggle, which other similar parties did in other European countries. So the Labour Party he regarded as being, because of its very nature, institutionally wedded to the establishment. So yes, he was very critical about the institution, that's the key point, not its ideology in a sense. The institution of the Labour Party he regarded is fatally flawed, fatally compromised, and thus not a plausible vehicle for socialism in Britain.
Ed Miliband's father had it right when he said one of the biggest illusions that socialists in Britain had was that the Labour Party could be an instrument of socialist change. It can't. It's now a party committed to a neoliberal agenda. It will provide what business wants because it sees the future with big business, and that's been its position for nearly a century.
Even when he was of the Labour left, he was very sober about the possibilities of the Labour Party becoming a socialist party. He had very few illusions about this. And although he was never in the Communist Party, always took the view that what was needed was a political reformation of a type that would allow for a democratic socialist party that had moved beyond the limitations of the old communist, Bolshevik, Leninist parties, and also the limitations of social democracy, which had become since World War I, and in the Labour Party's case from the beginning, primarily oriented to promoting class harmony rather than class struggle.
I first came across him when I went to LSE in the mid to late 60s, and he was one of the people that a group of us students really looked up to, because he was a big name because of his publications, but he was also one of those lecturers who really engaged with their students. They're saying something different, critical.
He was my teacher politically, and I think his capacity to teach, which was a very egalitarian sort of enjoyment of talking to other people and explaining and discussing and debating, is something that wasn't restricted to academe.
I did my MA at Leeds University, and Ralph was the professor there. Ralph was inspirational. I think probably one of the most inspirational and thought-provoking people that I've ever met in my life.
He's somebody who had the highest intellectual standards and wanted arguments to be well developed. I think he was very opposed to sloppy thinking.
What some people call the loosening of traditional morality.
I welcome it wholeheartedly, yes.
It took me a long time to warm to him, which I didn't do as a student at LSE, but I certainly did in later years, where I saw him with Marion and with the children, and they were an incredibly close-knit family.
He was enormously proud of his sons.
He was in many ways a male of his generation, wasn't very good in the kitchen. He made a mean tuna sandwich. If you went over there for lunch, you always knew you were going to get a tuna sandwich.
Hopeless, it's fair to say. After about 2.5 months of me having spaghetti with cold pasta sauce from a jar, I suddenly said to him at the age of 12, "Dad, I think you're supposed to warm up to the pasta sauce." And he said, "I think you're right."
We had students coming, you know, for sort of like an evening, and it's always turned into a seminar, and they would never leave till 2 o'clock in the morning. There was very much a pattern. But he liked that sort of thing, and the students liked it too, because he didn't just simply repeat what he had already written down, but he would work on... We've got packs and packs of paper, which are now in Leeds University, of all his lectures for every course that he ever gave.
The origins of the student movement, and all kinds of reasons for it, of course, but one of them was the sheer lack of connection between what we were being taught in the universities and the world outside. The Vietnam War was, you know, expanding, and political courses and social science courses had nothing whatsoever to say about that world. They had nothing to say about the civil rights movement in the States. They had nothing to say about apartheid in South Africa. And people just thought, what on earth are we learning at university that doesn't seem to relate to the real world?
There was this general exploration of finding new ways forward.
Students were questioning, what are we being taught in sociology? What's it about? What are we being taught about social policy? Why aren't we questioning the basic assumptions that are underpinning the social sciences? And I think so that had an enormous impact. And I think in that sense, Ralph's critical thinking was actually very influential, which is not at all to say that he was there at the barricades, because that wasn't his role at all.
If I think back to October 1966, I wanted to avoid taking a conspiracy theory view of the student discontents. I was at that time very impressed by the discovery of a number of concrete grievances that the students had within the school. They were largely to do with the existence of a certain arrogance, as they felt, on the part of certain class teachers and so on, and there were many statements going around, something to this effect. Our class teachers said to us, this isn't my real work teaching you, my real work is my research. It's just irritating chore that I have to perform in taking this class. This sort of thing, there seemed to be a good deal of that, and I was certainly reluctant to feel that it was more or less a political plot that was behind this. I rather thought that it had this sort of sociological explanation.
Ralph's absolutely principled view was that the students should have the right and the space to debate and question ideas and to question what they were being taught and to question the role of the university. He wasn't part of the student movement in the sense that he was certainly not there with a sledgehammer breaking down gates, which was one of the more better known episodes of the saga.
The big gates issue was only an issue for a week, only a public live issue for 1 week. If one thinks of that, then I think one is bound to say that these were not genuine grievances. They were deliberately concocted, invented, or if you like, discovered, but there was not a sense of grievance behind them. Rather, they were pretexts for further confrontations, and the idea of a confrontation, of somehow subverting the university from within, is not an idea that has somehow just developed, as it were, spontaneously in the present circumstances, but is an imported idea.
Ralph was absolutely there when it came to supporting the students' right to engage in these debates and to question. And he actually suffered, I think, quite badly for it, because he was then treated very badly, I think, by the authorities at LSE.
He was a member of the Labour Party, of course, through the 1950s. He only left in 1966 over Vietnam.
While he was always critical of the Labour Party, he certainly had some hopes. But unlike a lot of others on the left, including others in New Left Review, he didn't think that Harold Wilson taking over was an encouraging thing. He was relatively distrustful of him for a start. The Vietnam War very quickly was a crunch issue for him, a sort of the last straw issue. And he thought it was the issue on which the left had to unite, and he could no longer stay in the Labour Party.
When they backed the Americans' involvement in the Vietnam War, that had a catastrophic effect upon the morale of Labour Party activists. Without any doubt, it was the period when more people left the Labour Party than at any time since the end of the Second World War.
The Vietnam War had a profound impact on Ralph, as it did on our generation. We were a generation younger than him. But we worked together, attacking the war and Labour's refusal to break with the United States. There were no British troops in Vietnam, and Harold Wilson refused to send British troops to fight in Vietnam. But what angered us was the fact that they were supporting the war. And that and the big movement on the streets, which we built up, made it impossible for Wilson to go in had he wanted to. I personally don't think he wanted to be involved in that war. The first time I met Ralph was during the early years of the Vietnam War at the Oxford Teach-In, where he made a thunderous speech, extremely effective, denouncing the war and the role of the Labour government.
Mr. Wilson has said again and again that he is more interested in results than in ringing declarations. But the British government has made ringing declarations in support of the United States, in support of the American positions and its theses and its lies and its bombing.
There were two big speakers defending the war. One was the Labour Foreign Secretary, Michael Stewart, who made a glib but quite effective defence of the war.
But we should notice that it was not until 1964, 5 years after the attack started, that United States forces struck at the territory of North Vietnam. And even that they did not do until there had been an unprovoked attack on United States warships in international waters, the Gulf of Tonkin incident.
There was the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which at the time was used as a pretext, the idea that we've been attacked, this is aggression against us, thus we have no choice but to get involved. And we now know all the evidence suggests that's not what happened, and that whole incident, a staged incident, was used in order to facilitate what was a war of aggression.
At the heart of this conflict, there is a civil war, with on one side nationalist, socialist, communist, neutralist forces grouped in the National Liberation Front. And on the other side, there are the military men, the politicians, the landowners, the racketeers, and all the forces of property and privilege. And this is a core reality of the situation in South Vietnam.
I sincerely believe that the white paper produced by Barbara Castle gave or put the thought in everyone's mind that that something, in their opinion, had to be done regarding trade unions. I think certainly it gave the Tory party sustenance that they were going to, in the future, do something about it, when they can see, like the Labour Party, trying to bring to heel, and that's what they were trying to do, the wide Labour movement.
You know, once financial capital and industrial capital recovered from the Depression and the war, it would not be able to live with, it would, in a sense, grow beyond the regulations and the constraints that had been introduced really to bring capital back to health after the Depression. And so it wasn't so much a matter of Thatcher coming along or Reagan coming along with bad ideas. Heaven knows their ideas were evil. But it wasn't that turned the tide. It was that the possibility of capitalism living with those reforms, if one didn't go beyond those reforms, to begin to take the decisions about what's to be invested and where it's to be invested and how it's to be invested, if you didn't move beyond those reforms to that, then the conditions were such that the Keynesian welfare state would be exploded by its contradictions. And it was in that context that politicians like Thatcher, picking up the ideology of Hayek and Friedman and so on, were able to intervene, while the social democracy, the Labour Party, the Labour centre-right, was fully committed to sustaining this compromise with capital that had been developed in the post-war settlement, so to speak, while capital was abandoning it. And they did everything they could to sustain, keep that going, suppress whatever militancy that was emerging in the working class, in the social movements. They found it an embarrassment because they didn't know how to continue the compromise with capital when women were being so bolshy, when workers were refusing to cooperate via wage restraint, etc.
Did you know
40 Parliament. Answer that question.
I'd like to say to you that there are negotiations going on.
Shut the negotiations. Answer the question. Don't be a politician. Answer the question.
No, you're going to shout at me.
And it involved the type of leadership that would have taken that militancy and led it politically towards beginning to actually bring about a democratic transition to socialism. And they were determined that they were going to maintain their compromise with business at all costs. So yes, I think one has to say, if one's laying blame, that the blame does have to be laid as much, at least, as at the feet of those who tried to hold on to that old compromise that couldn't be sustained, as at the actual, running dogs of capitalist imperialism that have brought us neoliberalism and all of its horrors.
Ralph, it was very important for him that we faced an ideological challenge from Margaret Thatcher and from what we now call neoliberalism. And Ralph was very keen we should respond to it and do so in a completely serious way, not just with slogans, but with proper research and planning.
There is no question in the Falkland Islands of any colonial dependence or anything of the sort. We uphold the rights of our country throughout the world, and the claim of our country to be a defender of people's freedom throughout the world, particularly those who've looked to us for special protection, as the people in the Falkland Islands do. So far, they have been betrayed, and the responsibility for the betrayal rests with the government. The government...
He was obviously bitterly opposed to the war happening, and then he also saw that the war turned Thatcher into a far more popular figure, and that brand of conservatism into a far more powerful force than it had been before the Falklands War.
Once the guns started booming, people recoiled from saying nay. It happens all the time. The same in the United States. Our boys have gone in, how dare you say a word that would compromise what they're doing, and that kind of stuff. No, once the war has started, it gets to be more and more difficult. I mean, there was still, as you know, a good deal of protest and demonstrations and so forth, but they were very marginal, if that's to be said.
We're here for peace. We're here to save further lives being lost. And there are millions of people in Britain who agree with what we're saying. And what you're saying really is that in a situation like this, we should wind up our democracy. Well, I don't believe in that. That's what they do in the Argentine. I believe in people speaking their mind.
There were many on the left who saw the Falklands as a jingoistic, nationalistic, unnecessary war, and saw the way Thatcher used it.
If you think of Thatcher during the Falklands War, how she went around on a tank, there was a problem there. And it gave her an opportunity to take up the lead on a very sort of strong-arm basis. I'm not comparing her to Hitler, of course, but it is an opportunity. Trouble is an opportunity for some people, for politicians, some politicians.
The War Cabinet were meeting and passing on to the rest of the Privy Council on the opposition benches, like Foote, Steele, Owen, whatever, what the score was. And tragically, the Labour Party leadership got caught up in it. And it took about 32 of us to vote against it. We were actually spat on as we went through the lobbies. And I don't think they're all Tories that were doing it either.
Unless we can re-establish the ideas of internationalism and make them central to our message, then it is always open to this government or any other right-wing government to divert people from what has to happen.
He was constantly then rethinking his attitude towards democracy and how democracy and Marxism could be combined. And then he went through this period of strong anti-Labour Party sentiments. But to some extent, he rethought that again, particularly through his close relationship with Tony Benn in the 80s. I mean, some people take the preface to the second edition of Parliamentary Socialism, which he wrote in the early 1970s, as constituting his final belief about the Labour Party and saying the Labour Party could never, ever be anything other than a barrier to socialism. But actually that wasn't true. He was rethinking that again towards the end of his life. Once Benn had lost his leadership attempt, he got very close to Benn, and he hoped through Benn, as a left Labour politician, it might be possible to create something which would link the Labour left to another left, and a real new grouping might emerge out of that.
He, like many of us, kind of harbour the desire for a left party, but recognise that that's a complicated process. If it is to be a working class party, it's not a straightforward matter of saying it needs to be done, therefore let's gather the forces and construct it. I mean, the working class organisation emerges from actual struggles, and struggles are very complex now, so we have to pay attention. I think he would have been very curious. He would have put a lot of emphasis on actually understanding how, what the working class is now, and how people are organising and what can be learnt from what's actually happening on the ground.
Within the British political system, it's impossible to have a party to the left of Labour, given the electoral system. A party to the left of Labour that actually gets large numbers of votes and has some MPs and so on. So you have this constant tension of a left inside the Labour Party, trapped within the Labour Party, fearful that if they leave they will go nowhere, and a left outside the Labour Party, critical of the Labour Party, but also unable to do anything very successful outside of it, and this constant dialogue between people in and outside the Labour Party. And the Socialist conferences were a way of bringing them together, and Ralph was instrumental in that.
There was no question about setting up a party to oppose the Labour Party, but they set up something called the Socialist Conference. And it was partly inspired by the miners' strike of the 80s. Tony Benn was then MP for Chesterfield.
I condemn the violence too, yes, of the stone throwers and the battering ram carriers. And I condemn the violence of the cavalry charges and the truncheon groups and the shield bangers. Yes? I condemn violence. I abominate violence. I damn violence. All violence. All violence without fear or favour. That's what I do.
And this is what the Chesterfield Conference was about. After the miners' strike and everything else, you still had to pick up the pieces and think seriously about what the next steps were. And Tony was very, very kind to Ralph, because, as you know, he's a sort of loyal supporter of the Labour Party. He'd never desert the Labour Party.
The Chesterfield Conference has been a way really of tapping all these sources of energy, bringing them together. But I've never believed socialism was brought about from the top. It comes from the experience of people at the bottom. And the last people to get the message are the members of Parliament. I mean, when Parliament passes an act, the argument must have been over years ago.
The greatest of all illusions that socialists in Britain have is the notion that the Labour Party can be turned into a socialist party. I don't know that he would have put it that way until after the Wilson government. But he was right, and certainly I very much share that view, and I think it was proven by the admirable attempt of the Bennite left, of the Campaign for Labour Party Democracy, to democratize the Labour Party and to turn it into a socialist party, on the premise that unless you were able to democratize the Labour Party, you'd never be able to democratize the British state. And the failure of that left, which I think was a product of the right in the Labour Party, the centre right in the Labour Party, saying to them, look, it's as much our party as yours, maybe more, because the party has always been committed to class harmony. It's always been committed to making a deal with business, even when it spoke in terms of clause 4 terms of common ownership. It didn't see it doing it by mobilizing people into class struggle. There were elements in the Labour Party who always did, but the leadership from MacDonald on, for the most part, didn't. Ralph was right in that, I think, and I think it was proven by the 1970s and the outcome, which divided the party, I think primarily not because of Trotskyist interests, but primarily because of leaking into the public urinal by the right and center of the party, calling them loony left, et cetera, et cetera.
One of his long-term themes was opposition to American imperialism, and he'd been really critical of that all through the 50s.
One could say that the Gulf War was really a continuation of the US policy ever since 1945, of intervention throughout the world, and particularly in the Third World. If you think of it in terms of interventionism, which is calculated to prevent countries from doing things which contravene what the Americans thought to be in their interest, as in Latin America or Central America, or in Iran in 1953, Mossadegh nationalized the oil fields, and the British then and the Americans stopped Mossadegh and overthrew him. And in later years, in the 50s, the 60s, Vietnam and so forth. Saddam Hussein in Iraq is a bit different insofar as his regime is pretty fascist. And he was perfectly acceptable to the Americans and to everybody else in the Western camp, so long as he was doing things which were quite acceptable to the Americans and the British and the rest. When he fought Iran and fought an 8-year war against Iran, that was fine, because Khomeini was the enemy. And then he got a bit too big for his boots and started making demands on Kuwait and the rest, which the Americans got worried about. And then he went in, and they decided that he must be taught a lesson.
Missile away!
And that really, I think, is the basis of the war, the notion that they were upholding freedom, democracy, sovereignty, and the rest of it can be forgotten. I mean, it's just a ploy. I mean, the difference between many interventions that the Americans engaged in the years post-1945, the difference between that and this Gulf War is that most of the interventions that they engaged in were against progressive regimes, against reform nationalist regimes, which they called independence regimes, which they called communist. And it was very useful to call them communist. Some were, but most of them were not. And also, where they went into Kuwait this time, it corresponds to American policy now to bring it up to date, because it was a splendid occasion to overcome the Vietnam syndrome. I mean, when Bush came in, he was thought to be a wimp, and they were worried about the fact that the United States was still suffering from this recoil from intervention because of Vietnam, and they had to cope with a very important constituency, namely the American people. At one point, it used to be thought that hegemony, domination, means that a dominant class is able to persuade people that life is marvelous. That's not the way it is. It's not because they can persuade people life is marvelous. Much more important in making for hegemony is persuading people there is no alternative. And that's very striking in America, and that's very dangerous in a country like this, where the left gets to be obliterated or blurred, self-obliterated in many cases.
I feel that our current economic model is failing significant numbers of the population. I think there is definitely an appetite for change, particularly among the people I talk to most who are in their 20s and 30s. And the more you understand and know about alternative approaches to the economy and economic growth and economic equality or equality of opportunity, the more able you are to decide where to put your flag.
I would be cautious about going too far in that respect. I mean, I think Marxism is being talked about and thought about and applied to the post crash situation. It certainly reawakened a discussion, but if we compare it with earlier eras, I would say it's still a relatively minority discussion, and that it would be wrong to think that Marxism is as important on the left in 2013 than it was in anywhere near the late 60s, early to mid 70s. It's nowhere near as influential as it was then. But yeah, there's significant discussion again, which is clearly there.
The time is really ripe, I think, to rediscover the value of Ralph Miliband's work and to take some of that analysis and apply it to more recent times and situations.
The long-term impact of Lasky and Lasky's thinking, which Ralph rejected for quite a long period in the 60s and early 70s, he was moving back towards in some ways. And I think you can see that in his final book, Socialism for a Skeptical Age, which strikes a different tone from some of the earlier books. To do with both the Labour Party and social democracy more generally, I would say. I don't mean that he was completely converted to it or convinced by it, but I think that particularly with the collapse of communism, he was coming to see it as more probably the best hope, and I think he was constantly then rethinking his attitude towards democracy and how democracy and Marxism could be combined.
And when more and more people begin to think there is no alternative, and of course the collapse of communism and the end of so-called actually existing socialism has made it easier for the right to say, look, there's no alternative. That either you have us, capitalism, free enterprise, the market, or you have Stalinism. Nothing in between. Socialism doesn't exist. We have a long, long way to go before effective democracy becomes a meaningful concept. I don't believe it's possible unless you have something which I call a rough equality of power. A rough equality, not perfect equality. And that will take a hell of a lot of doing. I'm always amazed that people don't succumb more. When you think of the outpouring of the stuff from the Sun to the Daily Mail to the other papers, or all the so-called quality papers for that matter, or some of the quality papers.
Who's my battle with? It's with the Sunday Sport, because they published something quite scurrilous about my dad. It said this: Ed Miliband's dad killed my kitten. And frankly, you couldn't make this stuff up. Only a Belgian communist, could have killed a kitten in cold blood like that. The red bastard.
And people, you know, live their lives and watch the news, and it's fleeting. You watch it and you pass by and you hear this and you're, well, okay.
They hope to see this assisted by further reductions in the level of wage settlement.
There's all that legitimation process which goes on and which is very difficult to counter. Always been like that, and I think one shouldn't be too pessimistic about it. There are a hell of a lot of people who now say, what was the point of it all, where are we going, and so forth.
Now these are photographs from his 70th birthday party in 1994. It's his last book, Socialism for a Skeptical Age, and we had a cake made with that title for his last birthday party, and he died in May 1994.
This is completely blown up, of course, in the Daily Mail's face, and the YouGov poll today shows not only do people overwhelmingly want them to apologise for smearing Ralph Miliband, but even most Conservative voters want them to come out and apologise. Even UKIP voters want them to come out and apologise.
Dacre, Dacre, Dacre! Out, out, out! Dacre, Dacre, Dacre! Out, out, out! Dacre, Dacre, Dacre! Out, out, out!
This is a paper when Ralph Miliband was out there, a Jewish immigrant who fled the Holocaust, who fought for this country against the Nazis, whilst this paper here backed the black shirts and Hitler's genocidal regime.
It's a bit of an irony coming from a news outlet that sat with Adolf Hitler and supported the black shirts and the Mosleys. So I think it's irresponsible for them to attack Ralph Miliband, who was a strong campaigner against racism. After reading about him, I personally think that he's a hero.
There's an agenda everywhere which the social democratic left will have to address in relation to the growing inequality, the growing insecurity. Will the Labour Party be changed into a socialist party? No. But we'll have to see whether another Labour government creates the space for a new attempt to found a democratic socialist activist movement in this country.